Frank Morgan knew he would die in this blizzard. The bullet tore through the trunk of the pine beside him, spraying ice and bark across his face as he plunged deeper into the howling white void, clutching his 5-year-old son tight against his chest. Blood soaked through his shirt beneath his coat, hot against the freezing air that cut to the bone. "Run, Morgan!" The voice behind him carried over the shrieking wind. "But I'll find you and that bastard son of yours, even if I have to track you straight to hell." Another shot cracked through the storm, close enough that Frank felt the heat of the bullet pass his ear. He ducked lower, his boots breaking through the crust of snow with each desperate stride, lungs burning with every breath. "Papa," James whimpered, his small face buried against Frank's neck, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I'm scared." "Just hold on, son," Frank whispered, his breath forming ice crystals in his beard. "Death's not claiming either of us today." Dakota Territory, 1886. The worst winter in 30 years, old-timers were saying. 3 days ago, Frank had ridden out to check his cattle in the south pasture when he'd spotted the rustlers cutting his fence line. Blackwood's men, no doubt, still bitter about the water rights dispute that had simmered for years. The confrontation had been brief and bloody. Frank had put down 2 of them with his Colt Peacemaker before taking a bullet that carved a furrow along his ribs. He'd barely escaped, forcing his exhausted horse through deepening snow until the animal had finally collapsed from exhaustion 8 miles from home. With no other choice, he'd continued on foot, carrying James, who had begged to ride along that fateful morning. Each step felt like wading through molasses. The cold had long since numbed the pain in his side, but the blood loss was making his head swim, vision narrowing to a pinpoint focus. He followed the telegraph poles he could barely see through the white curtain of snow, knowing they led to the rail station, his only chance for shelter before the storm took them both. The distant yellow glow of the station windows appeared like a mirage. Frank almost wept with relief. He stumbled up the wooden steps, the platform boards slick with ice, and shouldered his way through the door. The warmth inside hit him like a physical blow. "Jesus Christ Almighty!" The station master jumped to his feet, knocking over his chair. "You're bleeding out, mister." Frank barely registered the words. He lowered James to the floor, the boy's face pale and frightened, blue eyes wide in his small face. "We need to get home," Frank managed, his voice like rusted nails. "Sarah, my daughter." The few passengers waiting for the delayed eastbound train stared openly. Among them, a woman in a dark green coat stepped forward, her gloved hands removing her hat. Her eyes, clear and steady as a mountain lake, widened at the blood seeping through Frank's coat. "Sir, you need immediate attention," she said, her accent marking her as from Boston or thereabouts. Her movements were precise, confident, not the nervous flutter of someone unaccustomed to crisis. Frank shook his head. "No doctors in town. Just need to reach home." The station door flew open again, snow swirling in around a small figure, bundled in a wool coat too large for her frame. 10-year-old Sarah Morgan pushed back her hood, her braid coming loose, her face red from the cold. A child-sized derringer clutched in her mittened hand. "Papa!" she cried, rushing to her father's side. Then, with a ferocity that belied her small stature, she turned to the woman in green, leveling the small gun with surprising steadiness. "Are you helping him or not? My father's wounded, and Blackwood's men might be right behind us." The woman glanced from the girl's fierce eyes to the gun, then to the bleeding man, and finally toward the tracks where the eastbound train would eventually arrive. Her ticket to somewhere else clutched in her other gloved hand. A decision formed in her eyes. "My name is Rebecca Hayes," she said, slipping the ticket into her pocket. "I was an Army surgeon's daughter for 15 years. Lower that gun, child. I can help." The Morgan homestead stood a mile beyond the cottonwoods, a sturdy log house with a stone chimney that now belched smoke into the howling gale. Frank had built it with his own hands after coming west, a fortress against both weather and men. Rebecca helped Frank through the door, Sarah leading the way with a lantern, little James trailing behind. Inside, the fire had burned dangerously low, the house growing cold. While Sarah rushed to stoke the flames, Rebecca eased Frank into a chair by the hearth. "I need to see that wound now," she said, already unbuttoning his coat with efficient movements. No hesitation, no squeamishness. Frank grimaced. "The children." "Sarah," Rebecca called to the girl who was still clutching the derringer. "Take your brother to wash up, and find me clean cloths, a needle, thread, and whiskey if you have any." The girl nodded, her young face solemn as she tucked the gun into her pocket and took her brother's hand. "Come on, James, let's get warm water." Once they'd gone, Rebecca helped Frank remove his coat and shirt. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along his ribs, already showing angry red lines of infection creeping outward. "You're lucky," she said, examining the wound with a clinical detachment that reminded Frank of battlefield surgeons he'd known. "Half an inch deeper, and we'd be digging your grave come spring thaw." "Don't feel lucky," Frank muttered through clenched teeth. Rebecca cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, using whiskey that stung like liquid fire. Frank hissed but didn't flinch. "My father was chief surgeon for the 7th Cavalry," she explained as she threaded a needle. "I assisted him since I was 12. After Gettysburg, we worked 3 days straight without sleep. This," she nodded toward his wound, "is hardly more than a scratch by comparison." Frank studied her face as she prepared to stitch him up. There was a hardness there, but not cruelty, the kind of strength forged through witnessing suffering without surrendering to it. "You came on the eastbound train? Nobody meets that train except mail-order brides and those running from something." Rebecca's hands stilled momentarily. "Edward Simmons, miner from Black Ridge. We exchanged letters for 6 months." Her voice was flat. "He wasn't at the station. Simmons died 3 weeks ago. Mining accident." Frank watched understanding dawn in her eyes. "Cave-in at the North Shaft. Nobody thought to send word, I reckon." Rebecca's face remained composed, but something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of vulnerability quickly masked. "So I traveled 2,000 miles for nothing." She knotted the thread with a sharp tug. "This will hurt worse than getting shot." Frank didn't make a sound as she stitched the wound, 11 neat stitches closing the gash. When she finished, he said, "Seems we're both having a run of bad fortune, Miss Hayes. You're stranded with nowhere to go, and I'm down 2 hands with rustlers on my tail and a blizzard bearing down that'll likely last days." The howl of the wind outside grew louder, rattling the windows in their frames. The blizzard had arrived in full force, nature's fury unleashed. "You and your children need someone to look after you until you heal," Rebecca said, washing his blood from her hands in a basin. "And I need shelter until the trains run again. I propose an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "I'll tend your wound, help with your children in the house. You provide food and shelter until the weather clears." She met his eyes directly. "I'm a good cook, I can sew, and as you've seen, I know my way around bullet holes better than most doctors in these parts." Frank considered her. This stranger in her fine Eastern clothes now stained with his blood. A desperate woman might do desperate things, but her eyes were steady and clear, with no hint of deception. "There'll be talk," he warned. "A woman staying alone with a widower. Folks out here can be quick to judgment." "Mr. Morgan," Rebecca said with a hint of steel in her voice, "I just traveled halfway across the country to marry a dead man. I think I'm past caring about frontier gossip." For the first time in days, Frank felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "Then we have a deal, Miss Hayes." The second night of the blizzard, a pack of wolves, driven down from the high country by hunger and cold, circled the Morgan homestead. Their howls cut through the shrieking wind, setting the horses to panicked whinnying in the barn. Frank stood by the window, rifle in hand, watching yellow eyes gleam in the darkness beyond the yard. The wound in his side throbbed with each heartbeat, but he ignored it. Sarah and James slept in the small bedroom, oblivious to the danger. "They're getting bolder," Rebecca observed, joining him at the window. She'd taken to wearing one of Marie's old dresses, the sleeves a bit short, but otherwise fitting well enough. "They've already killed something in the south pasture. I saw the ravens circling this morning before the storm closed in again." "Probably one of my steers," Frank said grimly. "Can't worry about that now." A large gray shape darted across the yard toward the chicken coop. Frank raised his rifle, but Rebecca was faster. She grabbed the Winchester leaning by the door, threw it to her shoulder, and fired through the partially opened window. The wolf yelped once and dropped, blood staining the snow crimson. Frank stared at her. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Rebecca lowered the rifle, her expression unchanged. "Kansas Territory, 1870. My father's clinic was raided 3 times in 1 month by deserters turned outlaws. After the 3rd time, he decided his daughter would never be defenseless." She broke open the rifle to reload. "The lead wolf is still out there. He's the one we need to worry about." Frank studied her face in the lamplight, seeing her with new eyes. "You're full of surprises, Miss Hayes." "In my experience, Mr. Morgan, most women are. We just rarely get the chance to show it." By morning, the wolves had retreated, leaving only tracks in the snow and the carcass of the one Rebecca had shot. The storm continued unabated, the world outside a white void that swallowed sound and sight. Inside, the Morgan home had transformed under Rebecca's care. The pantry was organized, meals appeared at regular hours, and even little James's persistent cough had improved with her treatments of honey and pine steam. Frank watched from his chair as Rebecca taught Sarah to knead bread dough, the girl's small hands covered in flour but working with determination. Something tight in his chest eased at the sound of his daughter's laughter. A sound he hadn't heard since Marie died 2 years ago, but worry gnawed at him. Their supplies weren't meant to last through a siege. The cellar held enough preserved food for weeks yet, but the firewood was running low. His wound, though healing clean thanks to Rebecca's care, still prevented him from chopping more. That evening, after the children were asleep, Rebecca joined Frank by the fire. "The flour will last another week," she reported, "but we're down to our last sack of coffee beans." Frank nodded grimly. "Wood's the bigger concern. If this storm doesn't break soon—" Rebecca hesitated, then asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Those men who shot you, Blackwood's men, they'll come looking when the weather clears, won't they?" "Max Blackwood," Frank said, the name bitter on his tongue. "He's had his eye on my water rights for years. He's Marie's brother, believes this land should have gone to her family when she died." He stared into the fire. "He once told me to my face he'd see me buried on this property one way or another. Your wound is healing, but you're in no condition for a fight," Rebecca said plainly. Frank's hand drifted to the Colt revolver that never left his side these days. "Won't have much choice if he comes." Rebecca was silent for a long moment. "My father didn't just teach me medicine," she said finally. "After the war, he never went anywhere unarmed. Said he'd seen enough good men die because they weren't ready when trouble came. That Winchester isn't just for show, is it? I can put 3 shots through a playing card at 100 yards, Mr. Morgan." Her chin lifted slightly. "And I've used that skill on more than wolves." Frank leaned forward, wincing at the pull of stitches. "What happened in Kansas, Rebecca?" Their eyes met across the small space, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, 3 men came to rob the clinic. My father was away. They didn't expect the doctor's daughter to be armed." Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened on the coffee cup. "I buried them myself before my father returned. Never told a soul until now." Frank nodded slowly. Some secrets are better kept. Like why Max Blackwood really wants your land, she asked quietly. Frank's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Your water rights feed the North Valley, but there's something else, isn't there? Something in the south pasture where you were shot. Frank was silent for a long moment. There's a vein of silver running through the ridge behind my property. Not many know about it yet, but those who do would kill for it, Rebecca finished for him, including your brother-in-law. That night, the temperature dropped further, the wind shrieking around the eaves like a living thing. Frank woke to find Rebecca by the window, his Winchester rifle cradled in her arms, her face ghostly in the moonlight, reflecting off the snow. There's someone out there, she whispered. I saw movement near the barn. Frank was on his feet in an instant, ignoring the pull of stitches in his side. He moved to the window, standing in shadow as he peered out. For a moment he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, a flicker of movement, a dark shape against white. Wake Sarah, he said quietly. Get the children to the root cellar. While Rebecca roused the children, Frank loaded his Colt, checking each chamber with practiced fingers. The familiar weight of the gun steadied him. He'd faced worse odds in his life. A pounding at the door came just as Rebecca and the children disappeared down the cellar stairs. Frank positioned himself by the hearth, gun at his side, but ready. Morgan! A voice bellowed over the wind. Open up! You'll freeze us to death out here! Frank recognized the voice instantly. What do you want, Blackwood? Just shelter from this damn storm. My boys and I have been riding 3 days. Frank's jaw tightened. Last time I saw your boys, they were shooting at me. A pause, then. That was business, Frank. This is survival. We've got 4 men half frozen out here. You know the code of the territory. You don't turn away travelers in a blizzard, not even your worst enemy. The code, the unwritten law of the frontier that had saved countless lives over the years. Even enemies would shelter each other against the killing cold, a temporary truce enforced by nature itself. Frank glanced toward the cellar door. Rebecca stood there, the Winchester still in her hands, her face set in grim lines. She gave a small nod. Any man who enters leaves his weapons by the door, Frank called out. And this truce ends when the storm does. When he opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from his grasp. 4 men stumbled in, coated in snow and ice. Max Blackwood, tall and broad-shouldered, his red beard now streaked with gray, stamped his boots on the threshold. His eyes, the same blue as Marie's had been, found Frank's immediately. Still alive, Morgan? Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. I was preparing to dig your grave. Not today, Frank replied evenly, hands still near his holster. Blackwood noticed Rebecca then, his eyebrows rising at the sight of the rifle in her hands. Making your women fight your battles now, Frank? Miss Hayes makes her own choices, Frank said, and she'll put a hole through you before you clear leather if you try anything stupid. The 3 men with Blackwood, hard-faced strangers with cold eyes, surveyed the cabin's interior with calculating glances. One limped badly, frostbite likely setting in. You can sleep in the barn, Frank told them. There's hay for warmth and a stove. Sarah will bring you food. The barn? Blackwood protested. It's 20 below out there. The barn has a stove. It's that or nothing. Frank's voice left no room for argument. Blackwood glared, but nodded sharply. Always were a hard man, Frank. Marie was too good for you. Frank's hand tightened on his Colt. Don't speak her name. The tension crackled like the fire in the hearth. Finally, Blackwood turned away. Come on, boys. Looks like we're sleeping with the horses tonight. After they'd gone, Rebecca lowered the rifle. You're not really going to sleep, are you? Frank shook his head. Not a wink. The night passed slowly. Frank sat by the fire, his colt in his lap, listening to the storm. Rebecca had insisted on taking a shift at watch, allowing him a few hours of uneasy rest. The children slept fitfully, James whimpering in his dreams. Just before dawn, Sarah crept from her bed to Frank's side. "Papa," she whispered, her young face grave. "I heard them talking when I brought the food." Frank straightened. "What did you hear?" "Mr. Blackwood told the others they should wait until you were asleep. He said they'd finish what they started and take the ranch and cattle." Her voice trembled slightly. "He said they'd blame it on the storm, and nobody would question it once the snow cleared." Frank felt cold fury settle in his gut. So much for the code. "Go back to bed, Sarah. Everything will be fine." But when she'd gone, he turned to Rebecca, who had overheard everything. "We need to move first," he said quietly, "before they do." Rebecca nodded, her face resolute. "What's the plan?" Frank outlined it quickly. Simple but direct. They would take the fight to Blackwood rather than waiting to be attacked. Rebecca would cover the house and children with the Winchester while Frank confronted the men in the barn. "If anything happens to me," Frank said, checking his colt one last time, "there's a strong box under the floorboards beneath my bed. Deed to the ranch, some cash, and a letter that proves Blackwood's claim to this land is fraudulent. He forged Marie's signature after her death. Take it to Judge Hollister in Fort Pierre." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Rebecca said firmly. Then more softly, "We need you." The simple declaration, "we," hit Frank with unexpected force. He looked at this woman who had walked into his life just days ago, now standing ready to defend his home and children. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand touching hers briefly. "Be careful," she said. "Blackwood fights dirty. I saw it in his eyes." The storm had eased slightly, the sky beginning to lighten to a dull gray. Frank moved silently through the snow toward the barn, his breath clouding before him. The cold numbed his fingers around the colt. He reached the barn door, listened. Low voices inside, the creak of saddle leather. They were getting ready to move, now or never. Frank kicked the door open, his colt raised. "Don't move, Blackwood!" Chaos erupted. Blackwood and his men scattered for cover, one reaching for a rifle leaning against a stall. Frank fired, the shot splintering wood by the man's hand. "Next one goes through your skull!" Frank shouted over the ringing echo. "You're outnumbered, Morgan," Blackwood called from behind a hay bale. "Be smart about this." "Smart would have been respecting the code," Frank replied, moving deeper into the barn, keeping his back to the wall. "Smart would have been leaving my family alone." A shot rang out, the bullet embedding itself in the post beside Frank's head. He returned fire, hearing a cry of pain. 3-1 now, but they were armed again, the temporary advantage of surprise lost. Another shot, this one catching Frank in the leg. He stumbled, pain searing up his thigh. Still, he managed to squeeze off another round, catching one of Blackwood's men in the shoulder. The man went down hard, clutching his wound and cursing. "Give it up, Frank!" Blackwood shouted. "You're bleeding out!" Frank's vision swam, the blood loss making him dizzy. He fired again, but his aim was off. 2 bullets left. Not enough. The barn door crashed open again. Rebecca stood framed in the doorway, the Winchester raised to her shoulder. She fired without hesitation, the shot shattering the lantern near Blackwood's men, plunging half the barn into darkness. "The next one's between your eyes, Blackwood," she called, her voice steady despite the tremor Frank could see in her hands. A tense silence fell. Then Blackwood's laugh echoed through the barn. "Well, well, the mail-order bride's got spirit after all. I came to marry a miner, not play nursemaid to a rustler with poor aim," Rebecca replied coldly. "Mr. Morgan may have qualms about shooting a man in cold blood. I, however, grew up watching my father amputate limbs without anesthetic. It tends to harden one's resolve." Frank used the distraction to shift position, ignoring the fire in his leg. But he'd underestimated Blackwood's cunning. A sudden movement from the shadows and Blackwood emerged, dragging James in front of him like a shield, a knife held to the boy's throat. "Drop the guns," Blackwood ordered, "or the boy gets worse than a scare." James's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his face. "Papa!" Frank felt his world narrow to a single point, his son's frightened face. "Let him go, Max. This is between you and me." "The deed to the ranch, Frank, Marie's land. Sign it over and you all walk away." Rebecca still held the Winchester, but couldn't risk a shot with James in the way. Frank's Colt hung uselessly at his side. "Papa!" a voice called from outside the barn. Sarah stood in the doorway, Frank's old Henry rifle raised to her shoulder, a gun almost as big as she was. "I've got Mr. Blackwood in my sights." Blackwood's attention shifted for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. James, remembering his father's lessons, went suddenly limp in Blackwood's arms, dropping his weight unexpectedly. As Blackwood adjusted his grip, James bit down hard on the man's hand and twisted away. Rebecca fired, not at Blackwood, but at the rope holding the hay pulley above. The heavy wooden block crashed down, missing Blackwood by inches but forcing him away from James, who ran sobbing to his sister. "Run, both of you," Frank shouted. "Back to the house." Frank raised his Colt, aiming directly at Blackwood's chest. "It's over. Max." But Blackwood wasn't finished. He lunged at Frank, knocking the gun aside. The two men crashed to the floor, Blackwood's greater strength nearly overwhelming Frank in his wounded state. They struggled in the hay, Frank's side screaming in pain as his stitches tore. Blackwood's hands found Frank's throat, squeezing. "Should have done this years ago," he snarled. "When you first took her away, she never should have married you. A ranch hand with nothing but big dreams." Frank's vision began to darken at the edges, his strength fading. The hate in Blackwood's eyes was pure and cold, a grudge nursed for years finally unleashed. Then a gunshot echoed through the barn, so close it left his ears ringing. Blackwood's grip loosened, a look of surprise crossing his face as he slumped sideways. Rebecca stood over them, smoke curling from the barrel of Frank's Colt, which she must have retrieved from the hay. She hadn't killed Blackwood. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, but the fight was gone from him. "The next one goes through your heart," she told him, her voice shaking now but her aim steady. "And I won't lose sleep over it, not after seeing how you treat your own flesh and blood." The sound of galloping horses approached outside. Frank struggled to his feet as the barn door burst open again, revealing Sheriff Tanner and 3 deputies, rifles raised. "What in God's name is happening here, Morgan?" the sheriff demanded. Frank leaned heavily on a post, his leg bleeding freely now. "Just defending my home, Sheriff. Blackwood and his men broke the code." One of the deputies nodded. "Sheep herder passed through town yesterday, said he saw Blackwood's bunch headed this way. Mentioned they were armed to the teeth. Figured there might be trouble brewing." Sheriff Tanner surveyed the scene. The wounded men, the frightened children now peeking from behind Rebecca, and Rebecca herself still holding the Colt with unwavering determination. "Looks like we missed most of the excitement," he said dryly. As the deputies rounded up Blackwood and his remaining men, Rebecca came to Frank's side, supporting him as he limped toward the door. "You need new stitches," she said, her professional tone belied by the tremor in her voice. "And that leg wound needs cleaning before infection sets in." "Reckon I do," Frank agreed, his arm around her shoulders, feeling somehow right. "Seems I keep giving you work to do, Miss Hayes." "Rebecca," she corrected softly. "I think we're past formalities, don't you?" Outside, the storm had broken at last. Sunlight gleamed on the vast white landscape, dazzling after so many days of gray. Sarah and James ran ahead through the snow toward home, their terrifying ordeal already fading into an adventure in their young minds. You were planning to leave when the train started running again, Frank said as they followed more slowly. Rebecca was silent for several steps. I was, she acknowledged, but plans change. They do at that. Frank paused at the crest of the small hill overlooking his ranch, the house with smoke curling from the chimney, the barn where Blackwood was being let out in custody, the white fields stretching to the horizon where, come spring, new life would emerge. Territory's hard on a woman alone. Rebecca smiled slightly. I'm not alone, though, am I? That evening, with Blackwood and his men safely in the sheriff's custody and new stitches in Frank's leg and side, the Morgan household settled into a tentative peace. The children slept soundly for the first time in days, exhausted by excitement and relief. Frank sat by the fire, cleaning his colt with practiced movements. Rebecca joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Sheriff says the judge will be through in spring, Frank said, accepting the cup. Blackwood will face charges for rustling and attempted murder. He'll be gone a long time. Good, Rebecca said simply. I showed Tanner the forged documents, Frank added. He was surprised. Said Blackwood had half the town convinced the land should have gone to him. People believe what they want to believe, Rebecca replied, especially when the lie comes from someone with money and influence. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Frank set his coffee aside and reached for something beside his chair, the Winchester rifle. He held it out to her. In this country, a person who knows their way around a gun has a voice, he said quietly, and I want you to always be heard. Rebecca took the rifle, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the stock. Are you asking me to stay, Frank Morgan? I'm offering you a place, if you want it. He met her eyes directly. Not as a nursemaid or a ranch hand, as a partner? Partner, she repeated, testing the word. Not wife? That too in time, if you're willing. His weathered face softened slightly. But first, partners. Equal stake in whatever comes, good or bad. Rebecca looked from the rifle to the man before her, not the husband she had traveled thousands of miles to meet, but perhaps the one she was meant to find. Outside, the Dakota winter stretched endlessly white and beautiful, harsh and unforgiving. Partners, she agreed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Frank Morgan felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, shared now with hands as steady and determined as his own. When spring finally came to Dakota territory, the snow melted to reveal green shoots pushing through the soil. The cattle were moved to fresh pasture, and the ranch hands returned to find Miss Hayes firmly established as the new mistress of the Morgan Ranch, now wearing a simple gold band on her left hand. If there was talk in town about the arrangement, it quieted quickly when folks saw Rebecca ride in with a Winchester across her saddle and deadly accuracy at the spring shooting contest, where she outshot every man except Frank himself. The women of the town were slower to accept her until the day she delivered the Henderson twins during a difficult birth when the doctor was 3 towns away. After that, she was sought out for her medical knowledge as often as Frank was for his skill with horses. On a warm afternoon in late May, a rider brought a telegram from the station. Rebecca opened it on the porch, her face growing serious as she read. What is it? Frank asked, pausing in his work on the porch railing. Rebecca looked up, uncertainty in her eyes for the first time in months. It's from my brother in Boston. He's been looking for me. She handed him the telegram. He says he's on his way with documents proving Blackwood isn't who he claims to be. Apparently, the real Max Blackwood died in '63 at Vicksburg. Frank read the paper, his expression hardening. Then who the hell has been trying to take my land all these years? Someone who thought nobody would question his claim to a dead woman's property, Rebecca said quietly. Someone who knew enough about Marie's family to pass as her brother. A man like that doesn't give up easily, Frank said, folding the telegram and handing it back. Even behind bars. No, Rebecca agreed. He doesn't. Whatever peace they had found seemed suddenly fragile, threatened by winds from the east and secrets yet to be revealed. But as Sarah's laughter rang out from the garden where she was teaching James to plant corn, Frank looked at the woman beside him, no longer a stranger, but the backbone of his home, and knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Partners, after all, stood their ground.